Thank you very much. We do actually have a question from one of our own tonight.
Okay.
If I start with that.
Hello, sorry. I feel like I'm jumping the queue a bit. I was just curious why wind turbines just had 3 blades, whether there was a reason for it or changing it would change the power output.
And there are all sorts of different sorts of wind turbines, actually, and some of them have got a different axis altogether, so they kind of spin around this way. But this has been shown to be the most optimal, so that is why there is 3. But they have tried other ones. You know, there are concepts with other numbers of turbines and different axes.
And we were discussing if that was a silly question or not. So if you ever think, is it a stupid question, just ask, because this is why you're here. You're with an expert.
And there are no such thing as silly questions,
exactly.
Are there?
So if you do want to ask a question, just pop your hand up and one of my colleagues will bring a microphone to you. And yep, we'll start in the middle over there.
You just alluded very briefly to the lifespan of these. I just wonder, what is the typical lifespan? What's the kind of elemental factors that have a bearing on how long they last? What implications are there for the sort of the other end when they need to be put out of service?
Okay. Great question. So the standard design life is between 20 and 25 years for offshore wind. This is lower than for hydrocarbon infrastructure that could have a design life much longer. And the design life is generally governed by the fatigue of the structure, because it's a very long, slender structure generally. And so the structural components degrade over time. But interestingly, lots of offshore wind never meets its design life anyway. The economic pressures are to decommission and put bigger turbines up. We saw how this really can enhance the amount of power output. So sometimes wind turbines don't reach the end of their design life intentionally. And sometimes, as we mentioned, by not really being able to capture the response of the seabed accurately at the design stage, means that there are unforeseen fatigue limit states as well. And so sometimes they don't reach the end of their design life unintentionally either.
Thank you. Next question. Yep, we'll go here. Thank you.
Thank you very much for a lovely talk. Just out of curiosity, what are you using for storage for the electricity? Because obviously it can't go onto the grid and be used.
Yep.
So what are you doing to, not you personally, but what are you doing to store the electricity?
And this is also a really good question, a really important one as we upscale to the amount of energy that we actually need to use, because energy storage is really a massive challenge. There's actually a very good RI seminar by another chair in emerging technology about battery technologies that you can look up as well. But there is a great deal of research effort looking at efficient storage methods. I touched briefly on hydrogen production, and that is also considered as a way of storing electricity from offshore wind. But ultimately, I think for the global energy balance, we need a portfolio of different types of renewable energy. So different countries have different kinds of renewable energy resources, but also for day and night and seasonal differences, better to have a portfolio to cover when you really need the energy to minimise the amount that you have to store. But it's certainly not a challenge that has been overcome yet.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I have a million questions, but I'm going to limit myself.
We're going to do one and then come back to you.
I might do 2 if that's okay. My question is, when we're talking about marine spatial planning, what's the governance considerations that goes into that? Like with the UK, for example, is there only so far out at sea that we can go? Or is it like a shared space? Or how does that work? First come, first serve kind of situation? And my second question is a silly question. When you were talking about hammering in the deep pile anchors, in reality, what are those? Because in my head I have a really big, someone with a really big hammer. But what does that actually look like in reality?
Fantastic. Okay. So with respect to your first question, it's a very good question. So around the UK, we've got an exclusive economic zone, or the EEZ, and that is where we can build offshore wind turbines or carry out activities within our own EEZ. And all countries have their own EEZ, which extend a particular distance out from the coast. The high seas are actually an area of extreme sort of governance exploration at the moment, as it becomes more and more obvious that there are many resources out in the ocean, not just wind resources, and it's essentially a lawless place. There is a law of the sea, which governs transit across and so on, but there hasn't really been the consideration yet about the resources and so on that lie beneath the water. So it's a very good question, and I think it's a bit of a work in progress at the moment, certainly for the high seas, beyond those areas of national jurisdiction. But all countries have their own area of national jurisdiction within which they can exploit, for want of a better word, their natural resources. So for your second question, I did think about putting a picture in for this. So basically, it's just a big collar that is put on the top of the pile, and it literally is just a big heavy weight that just bangs down over and over again off the sides of a boat. And when we were installing the foundations here, I guess we all walk around city centres and so on, and you see construction projects, but trying to imagine how this is done offshore, maybe hundreds of kilometres offshore, in tens or hundreds of metres of depth of water from a ship or a temporary platform, where everything is happening out of sight. It's really an incredible challenge.
Thank you. Also proof, not a silly question. Yeah, we've got two at the back. And is there anyone? Aha. We'll come up to the gallery first, actually, because I can't see beyond the lights, but we do have a question up there.
So, in order for this to be scaled up and we get to net zero, we have to get investments into offshore wind at a very, very large scale. I understand that the challenge is that the offshore wind projects, the rate of return is quite limited. So I'm curious about what kind of rate of return companies or businesses can get on their investments in this in offshore wind, and as a result, then how can this be scaled up if it's not attractive enough?
Okay, that is also an excellent question. And actually, offshore wind, I suppose, is moving forward because it has become cheaper than gas production to produce the energy. Certainly not the case for other renewable energies, such as tidal, which still has to be subsidised. So I would say the way to have offshore wind taken up more is actually to cut the subsidies of the polluting energy providers. They can be cheap enough already, the renewable energies, so take away the subsidies for polluting forms of energy. So there is essentially a carbon tax on those. But all of these emerging technologies and the innovations will help reduce the price more and more. At the moment, floating offshore wind is about twice the price of fixed offshore wind, which really has, grown at such a pace because it was innovated to such an extent that it could be competitive with other forms of energy, fossil fuel energy. And so we really need to do the same thing with floating offshore wind, because so much of the wind resources in those deeper waters that require this floating infrastructure.
Thank you. And do we have another one from up there before you have to run down? Thank you.
Hi, I would like to ask about the decommissioning part. So you mentioned both for fixed and floating. Floating is much more newer, but I feel like I think overall the offshore wind industry is still quite new. I assume there's not much expertise on the decommissioning. Could you tell us a bit on has developers actually really know much about this, what they put into consideration, and could you maybe just give a general explanation on how it all works? Is it just like a reverse process of the commissioning and construction? Yeah, that is a really good and important question. And we certainly should have learned something from decommissioning of offshore oil and gas. As I mentioned to the answer in the first question, offshore oil and gas has got a much longer design life. So actually, we've really only just seen the first wave of decommissioning of the offshore oil and gas infrastructure in the North Sea from the boom in the 70s. And it became very clear that no consideration had been given to decommissioning that offshore infrastructure at the time of its design. And so there was a general acceptance that moving on to a new type of architecture, it should certainly be considered at the design stage, how it was planned to be decommissioned. So, but there are nonetheless some significant challenges with decommissioning renewables. Currently, you're allowed to leave most of the foundations and the anchors in the seabed.
Although 90% biomass of an offshore wind turbine is made of steel, which is essentially recyclable, depending on the price of steel, it may or may not be recycled. And actually by volume, a lot of it is the blades. Not very heavy, but vast volumes, and those composite blades cannot currently be recycled. So they're fairly inert, so they're not necessarily a damage to the environment, but in terms of a circular economy, they're not there at all. And so actually the Royal Academy of Engineering, and Charlie leads this theme, we have a programme called Safer End of Engineered Life, which is very topical today because the theme of International Women in Engineering Day is doing it safer. So there is a programme called Safer End of Engineered Life that looks at all sorts of different types of engineered structures. And I lead the programme on offshore structures and ships. And we are just launching a programme on offshore decommissioning of decommissioning of offshore renewables. And so we are at that stage of really trying to engage with all the operators and the stakeholders to understand what their priorities are and how this can be embedded into the design process. So it's really important that we do it.
Thank you. So we had 2 questions from up there already, and then we'll come down to you again. So just at the back of the middle section.
Is variation in wind speed causing variation in power a problem in relying on wind power in our day-to-day lives?
So if it's too slow, the wind turbines just don't turn. If it's too fast, they're moved so they don't turn to protect the structural integrity of the blades. So when we saw that power output curve, you saw it kind of come in and then go out, and there was just a bit that was the slope. So this is when wind speeds are too slow to move them, and when they're cut off at the top end, so you don't damage the wind turbine. So there's certainly a sweet spot within which the winds have to be blowing to produce power. Now, what I would say is that you need to have a portfolio. So you can have offshore wind turbines, you could have tidal, you could have other types of renewables, solar. Some countries don't have coastline, some countries don't have good wind resources. So there are opportunities of having that portfolio of different types of energy to fill, when the sun shines or when the wind blows. You need to have a portfolio of different types of renewable energy, I would say.
Thank you. And there was another question from that same section.
Yes, so do you think in the future the energy sector will be moving towards offshore plants for other renewables, such as offshore geothermal or offshore solar? Is there any future in this?
So that's an excellent question as well. So there are other, obviously, offshore oil and gas has got a big thing there, offshore nuclear reactors. In fact, in terms of renewable, tidal has got immense potential, and the TRL, or the survivability of the structures, is really, I suppose, the thing that needs to be advanced there, as well as just the government backing to reduce those subsidies, or to increase the subsidies to make it more cost competitive so it can get a foothold in the market. Floating solar is a really interesting one because some countries really don't have, with the coastline, don't have very good wind resources, or they have very good solar, and so therefore you can have even hybrid platforms with turbines and solar co-located. So there are some problems with floating solar. All the current floating solar is on lakes at the moment, so very benign conditions, because if the water splashes, the salty water splashes on the PVs, this really reduces the efficiency of energy generation. But certainly we are looking into floating solar architectures as well, to be able to provide that portfolio of energy supply, and also to try and make the offshore renewables more equitable around the globe for countries that really don't have perhaps good wind power or places to store it, technologies to store it. Actually, can I also add that in some countries, there isn't a supply chain actually to install offshore wind. You need a lot of very big stuff, big blade, big everything. You need lots of access to lots of big vessels. Whereas something like floating solar would be very good for island nations, perhaps, who don't have the supply chains for the large installation vessels where you can tow out the PV panels. So there's definitely a huge amount of potential for floating solar as well.
Thank you. We had a question down here, and then we'll come to you afterwards. So just on the right-hand side of this middle section.
This may be another silly question. when you've got hundreds of thousands of square kilometres of offshore wind turbines, is there any concern that the wind patterns might actually change because the turbines are soaking up energy from the various wind farms?
So no such thing as a silly question. And so the wind turbines are spaced so they don't interfere with each other. The turbulence from the flow of the wind through the blades is all done with by the time it's passed through. So usually the turbines are put about 8 diameters apart from each other.
I wasn't thinking about turbines interfering with each other. I was thinking about the farm as a whole is soaking up energy, wind energy, and therefore whatever wind is coming, so to speak, coming out the other end of the farm is now presumably moving at slower speeds. And that means there's a sort of large-scale change in how the wind is behaving because there's a wind farm soaking up energy from the available sources.
Well, I don't know the answer to that question, but I suspect somebody does and has measured it. I don't think to an extent that it has been highlighted as a major issue. I guess if you have an onshore wind turbine just behind it, this could be a problem. Usually they're a bit out to shore as well, not to interfere with fishing activities. So I guess there will always be like some distance before the coast as well. So no, I think it's a good question, and I don't know the answer to that, I'm afraid.
Hiya. How did these floating wind turbines oppose the moment produced from the wind on the tower? Because with these anchors and lines, they're obviously these turbines are less rigidly fixed to the ground. So I was just wondering what the process is to, how you get around that.
No, it's actually a very good question as well. So a fixed turbine obviously isn't going to move around as much as a floating turbine. And it's the accelerations in this nacelle, like where the generator is, that is what causes the problems. And so for floating turbines, such as this one here, it will have a mooring line on it. But the mooring line actually resists the forces, so it's not really free to move around where it wants. The weight of this mooring line, or if you have a stretchy one, the stiffness of it is going to limit this watch circle of the turbine. So it limits the amount. That's why it's designed so heavy. We saw the size of those chains to stop the platform moving. Some platforms have active ballasting as well, where they basically pump water around these piers to keep it upright as well. There's something like 70 different concepts for floating offshore wind turbines. So people are trying to construct like the most ideal one, I suppose, for all sorts of different conditions. So ultimately, I'm sure a few will emerge as the market leaders. But at the moment, people are trying to come up with all sorts of different ways of making them ideal for the particular environmental conditions. But it's really all about the mooring lines. They're not. They don't just hold it in place, they actually stabilise it as well.
Thank you. Yep, just in the second row of the middle section.
So what kind of materials are you making the wind turbines out of, and like to kind of stop them from rusting and maybe lengthen their lives? And is that kind of eco-friendly or trying to be more eco-friendly?
That is a very good question, and it's very important that we do think about all of those, like the stages and the supply chain of providing renewable energy, which ultimately is eco-friendly. So 90% of an offshore wind turbine is usually made from steel, which obviously requires digging up iron from the ground and refining it and making it into steel. But it can be recycled afterwards, so there could be a circular economy about the steel. The turbine blades at the moment are all largely unrecyclable. They're composite materials, so they're layered up between the fiberglass and the resin, and these are very difficult to unpick. But certainly the big operators are all working towards trying to find ways to create wind turbine blades that are easier to recycle. So that has definitely not been achieved yet, but it's certainly a work in progress. In terms of the paint and so on, of course you need to be careful in the marine environment what you put in there. And actually a lot of the paints are engineered very cleverly to stop marine growth growing on them, because this makes them fatter, and then that attracts more load, and that's not really what you want. So actually, even the paint for offshore structures is really highly engineered to try and be not too bad for the environment, but also actually help the performance of the structure. And I can tell you one of my favourite stories about offshore anchors is that when floating oil and gas structures were first about, people used to paint the piles so they look nice and yellow, try to stop them from rusting. But actually, the smooth interface really reduced the capacity that you could mobilise, and what you really want is a nice rough interface to be able to mobilise the shaft friction that we talked about around the deep Paull foundation. So it's better not to paint your foundations, actually. Keep them nice and rough.
Thank you for your question. We have run out of time, I'm afraid. I know we've got a couple more questions, but we'll be sticking around if you want to ask. But yes, thank you everyone for all the brilliant questions. Excellent notes if you want to go build a wind turbine out at sea, like you might do. And thank you very much for joining us tonight, and a huge thank you to Susan for doing such a great talk. Thank you.